Hey, everybody, we're going to start our final panel of the McDowell Conference. First up is Peter Hershock, who's an intercultural philosopher who makes use of Buddhist conceptual resources and address contemporary issues of global concern. He was the director of the Asian Studies Development Program, and he's currently the adjunct senior fellow at the East-West Center in Honolulu. Please welcome Peter. He will now speak on existential risk or evolutionary opportunity, a Buddhist reflection on AI and human freedom.
Thank you, Jerome, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be back at American University. I was here a few years back for a conference on nonviolence, so it's a pleasure to be back on the beautiful campus. Dire visions of our future aren't anything new. But what's really distinctive is that it's only over, say, the last half century or so that the causes for existential worry have been pinned to human successes, not human failures or some kind of cosmic happenstance. So back in the 80s, Anthony Giddens and Ulrich Beck were talking about world risk society, and the idea that our technological and industrial successes are producing existential risks and other forms of threats that we need to take care of, even though they're the product of our successes, not our failures. So they use the example, for example, of a nuclear power plant and the risks that are posed by a nuclear power plant. It's a huge technological achievement to be able to build a nuclear power plant. But the consequences of that you're assuming as societies, lots of risk as a result of that. And these kind of concerns about existential risks that are human generated have really started to kind of snowball over the last 15 years. And I use snowball ironically because one of the big ones, of course, is climate change. And a second one would be global pandemics. Another one that was brought to light by Nick Bostrom in his book in 2014 on superintelligence is the possibility of artificial superintelligence, and then which that may pose some kind of an existential threat to humanity. So in Derek Parfit's terms, we seem to be breaching a time of perils in which the hinge of history, his terms, the hinge of history may close on humanity. And so it's a really interesting point that we find ourselves at technologically and in terms of our sort of engagement with issues like consciousness, with intelligence, whether artificial or human, and the limits of our knowledge and our capability of dealing with the kinds of systems that we're putting out, that we're designing, deploying, developing, and then living alongside of. In two of the bolder expressions of concern about existential risk, Toby Ord and William McCaskill at Oxford have basically made the claim on altruistic ethical grounds, their term, effective altruism, that what we ought to be doing is not worrying about these near-term risks like climate change or the next global pandemic or AGI, artificial general intelligence. What we ought to be doing is investing long-term in human futures. Because they say if humanity survives, if we survive, then think about what could happen over, say, the next million years of human evolution in history. What could happen if we had not just the 8 billion people on the planet today, but trillions of human beings colonizing the galaxy? What kind of creativity could come out of that experience of humanity surviving and then prospering in that way? I think it's kind of a starry-eyed view of the future. And while Ord and McCaskill both say that in order for this to happen, for humanity to survive, is going to require a moral revolution. But for them, the moral revolution that's required is to be able to set the needs of the current generation and near generations sort of a little bit lower on our system of priorities, and to really put our concern about where's humanity going to be in 100 or 200 or 500 or 5,000 years. And I think that that's interesting to the extent that it's predicated on one thing, that the prime value that they're talking about is the value of survival. And I'm going to suggest that as an ethical principle, survival sets a pretty damn low bar, and that we ought to be doing better than that. If we just allow that they were right, let's say that we were to survive as human beings are today for another 1,000 or 5,000 or million years, I think that solving these sort of near-term problems or survival is not going to address the very deep sorts of conflicts that already characterize our world. It's going to allow us to get past these current existential risks, but it is going to take care of the kind of conflicts that already characterize our relations with one another and our societies. It's not in and of itself going to do that. Something else is going to be necessary for us to do that, so that just navigating around the most dramatic sort of consequences of human conduct in the world is not necessarily to address the root causes, the root conditions of the conflict, the suffering, the trouble that we're all experiencing today. So improvising in a kind of non-dualist and non-reductionist Buddhist key, what I'm going to suggest is that these existential threats that we're facing are evidence of our arrival, our near arrival at least, at a kind of an evolutionary and ethical crossroads, where we as human beings are going to have to make some very serious decisions about changing course. And what I'm going to suggest is that we're not going to be able to slow down the technological juggernaut that is now underway, and I'll give some reasons for why that's the case. What we can hope to do, I think, is to do something like perform an act of kind of gravitational slingshot. If you know that from astrophysics, it's like you're heading with a satellite toward the sun, and you use the acceleration of moving toward the sun to slingshot you around the gravitational well, and then you go out to explore outer planets in the solar system. It's a way of taking the kind of attractor states that are currently available in society, working with those attractor states, but changing slightly the values and the intentions with which we're engaging them, hopefully to perform that reversal, not by putting on the brakes, which I think is impossible now, and not by just trying to reverse course. Crash landing, if you try to turn your car around at 100 miles an hour, isn't going to turn out pretty. We have to somehow make that turn. It's going to be an extreme and acute turn, but I hope that we're able to do that. I'm going to start by reading a quote. "Machines are gaining ground upon us day by day. We are becoming more subservient to them, and more men are daily bound down as slaves to tend them. The upshot is simply a question of time. But that a time will come when machines will hold real supremacy over the world and its inhabitants is something that no person of a truly philosophic mind can for a moment question." Some archaic reference there to men only. When do you think it was written? Samuel Butler, 1863. The title of it was a letter to the editor called Darwin Among the Machines. And his contention was that our relationship with industrial technology at that point was having us in a kind of a weird evolutionary moment. So evolutionary theory was relatively new at this point when he's writing. But he was already picking up on the idea that if we're talking about survival of the fittest, it's not a long shot to think that soon machines will be more fit than humans to persist in the kind of world that we're creating, in which machine-like conduct is increasingly expected of us human beings. So when Nick Bostrom comes up with his book, a century and a half later, Superintelligence, Paths, Dangers, and Strategies, he basically says the same thing that had been said by Butler a century and a half previously. Look, we're setting ourselves up for an evolutionary collapse, where the systems that we're putting into play, super intelligent AI systems, should they come about, we'll be able to outperform humans in everything across the spectrum, but based on what kinds of values, on what kinds of decision making. So from Bostrom's perspective, we don't know. And so Pascal's precautionary principle that was referenced to earlier, we ought to play it safe. We should be very careful about moving forward with artificial superintelligence. What's interesting, though, is we now live at a point 11 years after Bostrom wrote that book, when if you go to a chat system, like the recent versions of ChatGPT, the paid-for version at least, the paid-for versions are able to answer a set of 456 questions that were developed for people with postdoctoral levels of understanding of the human sciences and natural sciences. At the beginning of 2024, the system was able to answer the questionnaire, 456 questions, at a 38% correct rate. Human experts, that is postdocs, people with PhDs, full professors working in these fields, had a 68% correct answer rate. At the end of the year, with no training, additional training, the AI systems, 73% correct answers. In the Math Olympiad, these systems are now operating at the 90th percentile. So what we're talking about is systems that, at least in the narrow knowledge domains, can answer questions at levels of accuracy that exceed that of everybody but the most highly trained humans. Now, Bostrom's point is we really need to worry about that. All these successes, the techno-industrial successes that have led up to being able to develop these systems, which are extraordinarily complex, to be able to build these systems, has led up to this triumph of techno-scientific reasoning. And yet it's at the same time as it's kind of making come true the worries that Bostrom had 11 years ago and that Butler had 150 years ago. Alongside that, we've seen an increasing faith and kind of a reductive physicalist understanding of the world that suggests that, in fact, our human consciousness is maybe not something so special, that maybe sentience is really not the end answer. So if you take an evolutionary biologist like Richard Dawkins, he says, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind indifference. Or as much more acerbically phrased by Daniel Dennett, a philosopher, an impersonal, unreflective, robotic, mindless little scrap of molecular machinery is the basis, the ultimate basis of all the agency and hence meaning and hence consciousness in the universe. So this physicalist reductionist approach suggests that if artificial superintelligence does arise, and it's based on a silicon format, this is going to be a natural evolutionary sequence for people like Dawkins and Dennett. There is nothing to distinguish the human from these other systems. If they become more complex than us, more intelligent than us, they should inherit the earth. From a Buddhist perspective, this kind of reductive materialism comes as close as anything could to a heresy. Buddhism is not a faith-based tradition. It's not a tradition that's based on belief structures. It's based primarily on the orthopraxy, not orthodoxy. But if you had to say that there was something that would really cut against the Buddhist grain, it's saying consciousness doesn't matter. Meaning is irrelevant. That somehow at some level there's a way of describing the cosmos that we're in which you could eliminate consciousness, you could eliminate intention, you could eliminate purpose, and everything would go on as it already is. That is quite offensive from a Buddhist perspective. And what I'm going to suggest is that that way of looking at the world naturalizes these existential risks that we're confronting and suggests that we don't really need to worry about the advent of AGI or artificial superintelligence because it's just part of the natural progression of things. I'm going to suggest that's really wrong-headed and we do need to do something about it. So, there's no formal theory about evolution that you can find in the Buddhist canon. There is a lot of speculation about consciousness, though, and the ways in which consciousness and intentionality intersect with the world that we're experiencing. So what I'm going to suggest is that if we take the sort of core causal insights that inform Buddhist thought and practice, connect that with a way of theorizing consciousness that's non-reductive, non-dualistic, that we can get to an understanding of evolution that gives us some hope for the fact that we can turn things around with artificial intelligence, with our partnership with these new agential systems. So the Buddha's causal insights on the night of his enlightenment were twofold. The first was that material presence and sentient presence are entangled. They're karmically entangled. And what that means is consistently enacted patterns of values and intentions will bring about consonant patterns of both material and experiential results and opportunities. The karma plays out as a cycle. It's not a linear progression, linear causal connection. It's a cyclic, recursive causal pattern that plays out, so that every result of past activities is also an opportunity to change the track, the trajectory of our presence in the world. The second insight was that independent self-existence is an illusion. Everything arises interdependently. Everything is at root relational. David made a mention of Karen Barrett's work on the primacy of relationality. It's a very Buddhist understanding of things, that if you get down to it, all things, individually existing things, are abstractions from ongoing relational dynamics. Relationality comes first, The things that are related are abstractions from that. If I were to put it in the terms used by the Chinese Buddhist philosopher in the 8th century, he would say that all things are what they mean for all other things. We are what we mean for others. This way of understanding kind of the causal dynamics that we're part of suggests that consciousness needs to be understood somewhat differently than it's been in the kind of physicalist reductionist mode, where people say consciousness reduces to brain activity. And the Buddhists would say that doesn't make sense. The Buddhist line traditionally is that consciousness arises through the relation between a sensing presence and a sensed presence, between a sensing organism and its sensed environment. It's a bit anachronistic because if you take interdependence seriously and you take emptiness seriously, that nothing has a self-nature and it only is what it means for all others, well, you couldn't have a sentient being before you have a sensed environment. So what you're talking about really is a relational differentiation between a sensing presence and a sensed presence. That consciousness consists in the elaboration of relational possibilities, the coherent differentiation, most fundamentally, of matter and what matters for the continuation of sentient presence. So visual consciousness is the elaboration of visual relations. Auditory consciousness, the elaboration of auditory relationships, and so on. I just got the 5-minute warning, so this is going to have to rush up a little bit here. What does this say then about consciousness and evolution? Well, it suggests, first of all, that consciousness is in some sense primary. It's an ontological primary. We can't get underneath it. Ask what it would mean to live in a world or a cosmos without consciousness. We can only ask the question because of consciousness. So the Buddhist perspective, we can't get rid of that, so let's take that as our given. Consciousness is the driving force behind things. Consciousness is this pattern of coherent differentiation that plays out organically, culturally, and over evolutionary timescales. So from a Buddhist perspective, I would argue that what evolution is, the history of evolution, is the history of consciousness mattering. Evolution then needs to be re-understood. Contemporary evolutionary theory no longer abides by the kind of neo-Darwinian sort of idea that it's survival of the fittest competition, random variation, natural selection, and you prove your evolutionary worth by surviving against competition over scarce resources. That certainly happens. But it doesn't explain what happens at the crucial thresholds going from, say, inorganic to organic systems, going from single-celled to multi-celled, going from multi-celled to ecosystems, or going from biological evolution to cultural evolution. What we find happening at each of those stages, those kind of key transition points, those evolutionary moments, is an increase of differentiation within a community, a coherent differentiation within that community to create collaborative communities, cooperations that are operating such that they're addressing higher order aims or cares than any of the individual members. So Michael Levin has talked about this as evolutionary intelligence consisting in the expansion of the light cone of care of the individual organism. And where Kate Nave has done a really wonderful job of arguing against this idea that everything can be reduced to predictive processing, that we're just trying to adjust our behavior to be able to live in a kind of homeostatic relation with the world, that in addition to that, you have to have something that's purposive. Purpose is fundamental to evolution. Purpose, the expansion of horizons of care. What does it say about our current situation? Really quickly, my worry about where AI is going today, we could talk about large language models, machine learning, et cetera, how we're interacting with them. Lots of things to be concerned about. But for me, one thing is really fundamental. And that is that we have put in place a digital system, a digital attention economy, where our attention is being algorithmically analyzed and then affected, where these systems are taking our behaviors online, all of our interactions, and figuring out what we think, why we think what we think, how we feel, what we're going to like, what we're going to dislike, to be able to predict that. But to predict those things is also to be able to produce them. And when you are able to capture, hold, and redirect attention, The better the systems get at capturing, holding, and redirecting attention, what's at risk is our capacity for cultivating freedom of attention. What is attention? Attention is not just a quantitative measure of screen time. Attention is our evaluation of the world and our determinations of what matters in the world that we're part of. If someone is able to capture, hold, and direct our attention, they're able to capture, hold, and direct our determinations of what matters. If there's no freedom of attention, there can't be any real freedom of intention. And if there's no freedom of intention, every other freedom, including the freedom to engage in ethical deliberation, becomes either illusory or impossible to attain. So I find that with these systems, we're friendly confronting the fact that we could put ourselves in the position of being cornered into patterns of thought, habits of engagement, patterns of relationship that maybe represent the best of who we are today, but guess what? Look around the world. Look at Gaza, look at Sudan, look at Ukraine, look into any household where there's domestic violence. We human beings are not a very pretty species right now. And if we're training AI systems based on human data, that is human determinations of what matters, what's worth measuring and recording and then working with to train these systems, we are in a sense training these systems not just to be our mirrors, but to be karmic accelerators, to accelerate our progress on the lines of conflict, trouble, and suffering that we're already on. We're at an evolutionary and ethical turning point. I think we need to make a change. For me, what's crucial to that is not resting with the idea that there's some one ethical perspective that we need to take. Lots of people talk about virtue ethics. It's great. Consequentialist ethics, great. I mean, you guys, ethical students, you know all the different categories. But not many people are talking about the ethical value of virtuosity. What is virtuosity? Well, virtuosity means a couple of different things. If you're a musician, to be a virtuoso means you can play your instrument at a level that exceeds all current standards. You set new standards for playing that instrument. It also means that you're able to adjust to playing with other people, no matter what they're doing, in a way that keeps it musical, that allows that musical experience to be one that's rewarding. That virtuosity is setting new standards of excellence, both of practical efficacy and of moral integrity. And that what we need is a way of looking at ourselves in the world in which we take the challenge of saying we need to engage in that hard, effortful work. AI is setting us on a glide path into frictionless choice, where everything's going to be anticipated, and our likes and dislikes are going to be adjusted for, and we'll only ever be able to see content we enjoy, movies we like, read books we like. And I'm just saying, as a 70-year-old man, I continue to learn when people say, you know what, you could be wrong. You could be wrong about this. I could be wrong about consciousness. I could be wrong about karma. I could be wrong about a lot of things. And it's by hearing other people tell me where I've gone wrong that I can make adjustments and with effort, hopefully be a better friend, a better father, a better teacher, a better companion in this evolutionary and ethical venture that we're all on together. Sorry I ran out of time, but we have time for discussion. Thanks.
I really thought that was incredible. A really nice imperative for us to create some new norms, right? Okay, so next up is Dr. Atanasoski, Neda Atanasoski, who will be presenting on feminist approaches to AI in a new Cold War.
Great. Thank you so much for introducing us, Jerome, and thank you, Jen, for inviting me and for organizing this incredible day. I've learned so much from everybody. After the whole day, I feel like I need to start with a disclaimer and say I am not a philosopher. I am not a trained philosopher. I am not in a philosophy department, but I'm very happy to be here today. And hopefully there will be a lot of resonances between the talks. So on November 20th of 2024, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission released its annual report to Congress. Among its most pressing recommendations was launching what it called a new Manhattan Project for the development of artificial intelligence. Enthusiastically supported by the second Trump administration, the new arms race is about attaining artificial general intelligence capabilities for the US before China does. And so unlike existing AI, including generative AI and LLMs, artificial general intelligence, or AGI, is AI that is thought that it could surpass human intelligence in various realms, including cognition, reasoning, and even creativity. Because most experts agree that it doesn't yet exist, but would be such a powerful tool and weapon, the new Manhattan Project stresses the urgency for US research and development in this field. So it's important to remember that the original Manhattan Project was the name given to the US research program charged with rapidly developing the atomic bomb during the Second World War. At that time, the US government initiated an unprecedented big science collaboration between the military, the academy, the private sector, that eventually resulted in the weapons that wreaked violence of extraordinary scale upon the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. After the Second World War ended, the arms race continued and ushered in the Cold War, in which the United States and Soviet Union developed atomic weapons of greater and greater potential for mutual destruction. Framed in the US as an ideological conflict between liberal democracy and communist totalitarian rule, the drive to maintain global dominance had lasting and catastrophic ecological and health impacts on communities ranging from the Marshall Islands to indigenous communities in the United States, where uranium mining and nuclear waste disposal took place. The pursuit of AGI presents two contrasting approaches. One, a sequel to the Manhattan Project, revives the specter of annihilation, complete with escalating geopolitical tensions, advancements in weaponry, and environmental repercussions. Like the atomic bomb itself, which conjured an existential threat, many scientists, including Nobel Prize winner and neural net pioneer Geoffrey Hinton, have warned that when we create digital beings that are more intelligent than ourselves, we have no idea whether we can stay in control. The other perspective, however, offers a seeming counter-narrative. Some computer scientists, physicists, and theorists have contended that advanced AI broadens our understanding of what life is and opens new possibilities for envisioning future life. In a 2023 essay, astrophysicist Sarah Imari Walker declared that AI is life. Expanding on conceptions of what life is, attempts to apprehend AI and the race for the holy grail of a general artificial intelligence smarter than humans supplements the human as a moving target. The moving target to reach now seems to be life. As I'll suggest, however, extractivist technoscientific ambitions continue to dominate the question, what is life and what will life become? Whereas post-colonial, decolonial, and critical race and feminist scholarship has extensively considered the sliding scale of humanness, and we've heard a little bit about this, and who or what have historically been included or excluded from that category human, these fields have yet to consider how various conceptions of life differentially shape relations to land, property, and resources. In some instances, these are also tied to eugenic fantasies of what future life and future humans will be. While imagining the future of AI as either a tool of annihilation or a new form of life seem diametrically opposed, I want to begin to think through how feminist approaches to technology reveal the entanglement of these two approaches in the contemporary workings of technologically augmented racial capitalism. So let's begin with this proposal for the new Manhattan Project for AI, a response to US concerns that China is rapidly advancing and potentially surpassing the US in AGI capabilities. Akin to the original Manhattan Project, proposals for the AI Manhattan Project include government-industry collaboration, large-scale investment that would increase AI infrastructure, such as data centers, and deregulation that would accelerate the development of AGI technologies and the testing of various AI applications. And like the USSR before it, China's technological capacity is framed as a threat due to China's ideological positioning. The US imperative to attain AGI is thus ostensibly about defending freedom or democracy itself. And of course, there's a conflation here between freedom, democracy, and free markets that extends from the Cold War era. So the 2024 congressional report that I opened with states that, quote, the Chinese Communist Party continued to pursue a technology-focused strategy to expand internal political surveillance and suppression of dissent. Doesn't sound that different from what's happening in the US today. The centralized top-down approach is reminiscent of Mao-era authoritarianism, end quote. And so the report calls this Chinese techno-nationalism and Chinese AI development as being about the spread of authoritarianism. And then the report contrasts this to, quote, the market-oriented innovation landscape of the United States, which I think masks the ways that market logics intensify domination, surveillance, and modes of unfreedom. This is a distinction that falsely portrays US capitalism, which is built on the legal principles of racialized and gendered property relations, as a democratic and open alternative to Chinese techno-nationalist illiberalism built on a nexus of state surveillance. By contrast, feminist approaches to technology show that technological development and design both fuel and are fueled by global relations of power, rooted in the legacies of colonial and capitalist exploitation of both people and resources. For instance, the national laboratory infrastructure that emerged from the original Manhattan Project and necessitated large land grabs to launch nuclear arms research now serves the massive data and computing needs for today's race for AGI. The Los Alamos National Lab, the birthplace of the first Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb, not only appropriated indigenous Pueblo land, but for decades after leaked toxic materials into the air, water, and soil. According to Joseph Masco, the infrastructure supporting the Manhattan Project and its legacies enabled the US to build itself via the bomb, remaking its political, military, and academic institutions around the nuclear revolution. Yet, he writes, the atomic bomb has always presented a foundational challenge to the democratic order, as it was made in secret, relies on the production of existential enemies, provokes a genocidal imaginary, and locates sole authority to launch a nuclear war in a single individual. Tracking the genocidal and anti-democratic infrastructures of the Cold War nuclear complex into the present-day empire of AI, we can see these same laboratory complexes and their ideological scaffolding converted today to serve today's cloud computing complex in a race towards AGI. And as soon as he began his second term in office, Donald Trump stated, quote, I'd like to see federal lands opened up for data centers, and the Department of Energy has since identified 16 federal sites, including Los Alamos, Sandia, Oak Ridge, and others, as prime real estate for new data centers to fuel AI research. Meanwhile, such hunger for data centers raises another existential question pertaining to climate catastrophe, which we've heard a little bit about today. In April of 2025, the International Energy Agency released a report finding that data centers made up 1.5% of total global energy use in 2024. Additionally, data centers' electricity consumption has grown 4 times faster than overall consumption in recent years. So it may seem that the race to attain AGI is then draining the life out of the planet. Amid growing concerns about generative AI's potential for annihilation of life as we know it through its environmental impact, military consequences, and threats to human jobs, capacity to think, etc., there's a parallel move in a number of fields towards viewing AI as an emergent form of life, an expansion of how we should think about our planetary futures. And in my ongoing research with Felicity Amaya Schaefer, we consider how in this line of thinking, computation and information redefine life and posit that intelligent life does not emerge without coevolution with technology. Despite offering a seemingly optimistic perspective that counters the destructive one outlined above, I want to ask, what happens when computation, information, and the ideals of technological progress colonize conceptions of intelligence, of life, and of planetary futures? What kinds of existing lives and intelligences risk eradication? The technologies that have historically been selected for development, after all, come from colonial and racial capitalist values about futures worth pursuing and developing. Just as Darwinian theories of selection and evolution reflected a racial and colonial framework of theorizing extinction and futurity, it's critical to also consider how today's theories of information and technological coevolution tie theories of life to dominant Silicon Valley values. But sidestepping these questions, information and computation theories of life insist they're moving past a human-centered paradigm. Google vice presidents Blaise Aguirre-Yarcas and James Manica, for instance, argue that our current paradigms for understanding life are akin to old geocentric models for understanding the universe. They write, "Perhaps the greatest Copernican trauma of the AI era is simply coming to terms with how commonplace general and non-human intelligence may be." And they explain that while it may be counterintuitive to argue that life is computational because we think of computers as decidedly not alive and of living things as most definitely not computers, DNA is, after all, just code. And so they propose that a computational approach to biology lays the groundwork for artificial life and its emergence. And so here you see a still from their recent experiments in Google Paradigms of Intelligence team that have shown that in a simulated toy universe capable of supporting computation, we can go from nothing but randomness to having minimal life forms emerge spontaneously. And they write, "There's something magical about watching complex, purposeful, and functional structures emerging out of random noise in our simulations." Similar phase transitions, they go on to say, from non-life to life occurred on Earth billions of years ago, and we can hypothesize similar events taking place on other life-friendly planets or moons, end quote. So the creation of this artificial life, these self-replicating programs that arise spontaneously from data, serves for them as a direct analogy for the emergence of biological life on Earth and indeed for life in the universe as a whole. However, in their analogy, there is an erasure of the earthly material resources, labor, and energy needed to generate such artificial life that is now propped up as a model for understanding the origins of life in the universe. So computation then is no longer connected to the political, social, and historical context of its own emergence. And astrobiologist and theoretical physicist Sarah Imari Walker, meanwhile, proposes that AI is life because technology is life. And she writes, "ChatGPT wouldn't exist without the evolutionary divergence of the human lineage from apes, where humans went on to develop language." Walker argues that information that produces life and its evolution is not just genomic information. Rather, information produces everything around us, including things not traditionally considered life. Human technology would not exist without humans, so it's therefore part of the same ancient lineage of information that emerged with the origin of life. Considering the prospect that AI is converting our biosphere into a technosphere, Walker states, "Technology is life because technologies emerge from what has been selected to exist and because they are also, technologies also, select among possible futures and build them." So she grants technology agency over the selection of human and planetary future. The seeming expansiveness of the category of life is again framed as a move away from the provincial insistence on anthropocentric and human-centric approaches to intelligence and existence. And so this approach seems to be of a kind with feminist science and technology studies. Yet, when presented in a historical vacuum, the information theory of life erases the human selection of technology for militarism. Think about the Manhattan Project for AI, the exploitation of natural resources, and the propagation of capitalist relations and labor exploitation necessary to train AI. It also selects certain languages, knowledges, and forms of intelligence for amplification, rendering these normative. These selected technologies and how humans choose to use them have helped make faster, more efficient, and more profitable the extinguishing of colonized lives and knowledges, and they have facilitated extractive planetary relations. Additionally, theories of life that uncritically conflate technological innovation with a notion of evolution as progress exclude many people on Earth from the category of intelligent or evolved life. Writing in a very different context about how the search for extraterrestrial intelligence uses the principle of the Great Filter to speculate that life elsewhere developed advanced technologies in the same way as it did in Europe and the colonies, William Lempert observes that there may in fact be numerous extraterrestrial intelligences throughout the universe that can't be found because of their sustained avoidance of the self-destructive expansionist behavior that some SETI researchers celebrate. And furthermore, it's worth considering who the Great Filter excludes, namely every non-expansionist human society, past and present, and everyone that has not produced radio telescopes or attempted space travel. This includes every indigenous society, this is Lempert, not to mention nearly all others. By this logic, Aboriginal Australians who've lived relatively sustainably for the last 80,000 years have failed to pass through the Great Filter. Meanwhile, Western societies that threaten to render Earth uninhabitable in the near future are positioned as at the precipice of transcendence. And I've received my warning, so I'll just say that I want to conclude with a really different approach to AI as life, articulated by Indigenous feminist scholar and artist Suzanne Kite, who is incidentally one of the co-authors on the Making Kin with the Machines article that David quoted from in the keynote. And so this is an image from Kite's recent installation, Dreaming with AI, which assembles performance and video art and indigenous knowledge. And the exhibit includes stones, minerals, and rare earth materials, often used in computing technologies, illustrating that in Lakota culture, these materials are not inanimate objects, but living beings imbued with spirit and volition. So seemingly this aligns with these recent moves in computational fields to recognize non-human life, but Kite reaches a very different conclusion about the potential of AI as life, and writes, "The agency of stones connects directly to the question of AI, as AI is formed from not only code, but from materials of the earth. To remove the concept of AI from its materiality is to sever this connection. Relations with AI are therefore relations with exploited resources. If we're able to approach this relationship ethically, we must reconsider the ontological status of each of the parts which contribute to AI, all the way back to the minds from which our technology's material resources emerge." The piece also critiques the Western view of both the human and the non-human as exploitable resources, which is the result of an epistemology of control, and is indelibly tied to colonization, capitalism, and slavery. And so recall Jeffrey Hinton's fear about AGI as being about the loss of control, the loss of human control. And then she writes, "Slavery, the backbone of colonial capitalist power and the Western accumulation of wealth, is the end logic of an ontology which considers any non-human entity unworthy of relation. This approach to AI and technology sheds light not only on how technological relations are founded upon the exploitation of natural resources, but also on how settler, colonial, and capitalist ontologies obscure their relations of productions in hyped AI futures. Unlike most information and computation theories of life, it also centers non-Euro-American articulations of life and intelligence as relation, rather than to posit life and intelligence in a hierarchical way, based on ideas about hierarchical progression couched in the language of natural evolution and selection. So through feminist methods of analysis and creative interventions, like the art piece I showed, and here is another art piece that kind of thinks about the organic in relation to technology with the artist Marjan Katabi that I recently worked with. We can begin to imagine modes of intelligence that move beyond extractive or hierarchical answers to the question, what will life become? So I will end there.
All right, folks. So if you have questions for either talk, we have a microphone over here, and if you can line up for your questions, identify which speaker you wish to pose a question to.
Okay, I'll start. This is actually for Neda, although I'd be interested in what either of you has to say about this. So I wonder if we're not getting into a bit of a problem with the usage of the term life here. And I'm actually thinking of Melinda Cooper's first book, right? Where the thesis of it basically is that somewhere in the mid-70s, capitalism got to life and recoded life as that which would necessarily overcome scarcity. And so in response to the Ehrlichs and the population bomb, all of a sudden, it's biocapital, life, and futurity. I wonder if we don't want to pause there before we even get to the question of sentience or conscience or computation, that there wasn't a wrong turn. And you sort of see in the art, right, the move away from chemistry. It's like, well, no, DNA is also molecules. It's not just code. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the term life is appearing rather than consciousness, especially among, I mean, I think it's there's this kind of interest in thinking about human co-evolution with the technology. And for Sarah Walker in particular, it's about redefining, kind of finding a new universal law that's going to basically saying that biology is very limited in that we don't have a universal way of understanding what life is even on Earth. So how will we understand what it is on other planets and when we encounter it? And so turn into then computation and information for her in particular is a way to think about kind of finding this new universal law of life. And I think what I was interested in is kind of why does AI become that occasion for her to sort of do that rethinking. But I certainly, I think the problem with this category of life in part is that there is sort of no agreed upon definition of it. And for some of the computer scientists that I spoke about, the biological definition is kind of very descriptive and not satisfactory, not even kind of true across, different scales, et cetera. So I mean, I think that that's partly what they're thinking about.
I might have a shot at that as well.
Yeah.
First of all, let me apologize for so much disconnected phone. Every time you do it, you're not sure how it's going to come out. And this case is like, a bit spotty. I'll blame that on you. I think the question is really interesting. It's going to go to a lot of these issues of life, consciousness, sentience, that's important. All of these terms are being discussed. And I think from a Buddhist perspective, and the things that we really remind ourselves is that all of our concepts about the world are our ways of dividing the world. They're based on patterns of our habitual and sometimes not habitual, but usually it's habitual relations, sort of installation of relational dynamics. I don't think any of them. And that we're responsible. So for me, I think whether it's life or consciousness or sentience, given the fact that these concepts are all ones for which we as humans have responsibility for determining what the boundaries of something are, we determine the boundaries of life, of consciousness and sentience. And given the fact that with a bit of epistemic humility, none of us really knows what life is or what consciousness is, we have no agreed upon definition. And what we want to do is to consider the theorizing process to be one where our guidance should be ethical. So if we have to decide among different theories, one way of looking at that is which theories have the most significant ethical implications, and to think of it that way first and foremost. So that's what I've done with respect to consciousness, but I think with respect to life, the same thing plays out. What are the most ethically efficacious ways of theorizing life, and efficacious ethically for what purposes, to what end, in accord with which values? And that's a discussion that I think we ought to have collectively, and not have authority figures, whether in Silicon Valley or at the heads of national governments, be the ones who are in charge of that.
That leads really nicely into my question. I was going to ask you if you both were tasked with creating policy or regulations for companies that are innovating these technologies, what would you prioritize or ask of them?
I think with companies, it's a little bit difficult. And I think the idea of them self-regulating is the model that's been adopted in the US. In the EU, the model is more, we've got EU governance over systems, tell you what you can and can't do. China is something sort of in between the two. I think more important for me is issues about data governance, and that's our angle of entry in. I think that we ought to have several universal human data rights. One is the right to own our own data, that nobody else should own our data. I think our data is like not a digital exhaust that you're happy to get rid of, like the stuff that comes out of the back of a carbon-burning car. You know, our data is not an exhaust. Our data is a residue, and it's the same kind of residues you have from genetic material. We wouldn't want somebody taking our genetic material and cloning us. We shouldn't allow people to make digital clones of us, not without our explicit permission. So I think that one's basic, own our own data. Secondly, I think we need a mechanism for being able to decide what our data is used for, whether that's a data collective model, like's been forwarded by some folks like Alex Pentland at MIT. There's different models for that, but I think we need to rethink the way in which data is stored, that data could be stored in collectives that have a fiduciary responsibility to only allow algorithms to run on that data that we've approved the purposes of. So if you only want your data to be used for medical research, so be it. No other kinds of algorithms other than those for medical research could be used on your data. So I think that's really basic. And then I think we need to have a right to be able to move our data at any time that we want. If the collective's not doing what we want it to do, we have a right to move that data. So I think that would sort of shift the dynamics a little bit. But overall, kind of like referencing, maybe leading into what Neda might be able to respond to given the setup for her talk. I think the worst case scenario would be one where we take this Cold War competition between China and the US, EU, Africa, Latin America, they don't really matter, between China and the US, and to say that it's like the Cold War dynamic. If you've got a zero-sum competition, you've only got two outcomes, checkmate and stalemate. Because checkmate option is US wins or China wins. I think that's disastrous for humanity and the planet, either one. If it's the stalemate version, and what that means is a balkanization of governance regimes, where every regime gets to have their own governance structure within the Islamic world, within the Latin world, within, some Baltic states come together from balkanization, and they have their own version. I think that works against the ways in which human data can be really productive in engagement with AI systems, because you need complete data. That's what earlier talks were talking about, incomplete data, insufficient data. We need to correct that so you have global access to data, but it somehow has to be done without this balkanization or the stalemate or checkmate versions. Yeah.
I'll try to be brief. I guess that I don't start with the question of regulating corporations, because corporations are ultimately, whether regulated or not, going to be focused on profit, right? Making profit. Even when I think about something like owning our own data, which obviously I don't disagree with, I think about how even that posits like the horizon of what we can imagine in relation to the common good. as still about a kind of propertied relation, which in the context of racial capitalism has historically always been a racial, like only certain people have been able to possess themselves historically. And now that we're thinking about data theft and things like that, right, it's all of a sudden there's a kind of fear that people are becoming property. And similarly with privacy, right, as I've written about elsewhere, the history of privacy itself in the US is a racial history, right? It comes out of the late 1800s and the worry with the new technology then, instant photography, white women's photographs were gonna be circulated. And so Warren and Brandeis articulate a right to be left alone. And so I think it's important when I think about the political horizon of like how we imagine what makes a good technology, something I'm struck by is like, I feel like we've become so limited in what we can imagine can be like the good. I think you had mentioned survival as kind of like this very low bar. I mean, I think about like we need our privacy. Like it's such a limited political horizon. So I don't really have an answer to your question, but I feel like, and certainly currently in the next couple of years, I mean, now regulation seems like, wow, that would be amazing. But yeah, I like if I were thinking grander, I would want to think beyond just regulating corporations, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Neda, first of all, I just wanted to say I thought your talk was like so interesting, and I came up with 2 questions for you. So I don't know if anyone in this room has heard the term clanker to refer to like AI that we all don't like, and it's unfortunately becoming a slur. My question to you is, how do you think AI, whether it's super intelligent or at least like AGI to the point where it's able to form its own thought, how do you think that'll be racially triangulated within the identities that we already have in the US?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that I've written about elsewhere is kind of like the metrics that people use to measure like how good the AI is. So there was sort of the infamous way in which the definition of intelligence used by the Microsoft researchers to evaluate, I think it was like 3.5, used the definition of intelligence from the book The Bell Curve from the 90s. And then they kind of like retracted that citation, but the kind of like how they were defining intelligence didn't really shift in the paper. That's sort of why and even like the kind of the astrophysicists and computer scientists I was talking about who are, talking about life and evolution, still there's this kind of hierarchy, there's this progress, there's this like selection for kind of advancement, acceleration, et cetera. I think all of those, directly tie to, the colonialism, histories of racial exploitation, et cetera. So I don't think we have to dig deep because those values that we inhabit in the current kind of moment that we're living in from the position of the US, of course, those are the values that are going to be engineered and programmed into the technologies that we use. I don't know if that answers your
Absolutely.
question.
Well, that like totally gave me a ton to think about. And then I guess my second question is like, we as a society have determined that it's okay to test on lab rats because we don't think that they're like intelligent enough to suffer, I guess. At what point do you think we will determine it's not okay to test on AI? Like with lab rats, we obviously test like cosmetics on them and stuff like that. But do you think that there's a world where we could be testing some harmful forms of thought on AI? And when do you think we'll determine that it's not okay to do that?
I don't feel like I can.
Okay.
I feel like I can. This is where I'm not a philosopher. I don't know if you have a.
I like jumping off of speculative bridges just
Yeah.
to see what happens. And lots will depend on what we mean by sentience or consciousness. So my way of theorizing consciousness sort of non-dualistically is the differentiation, the coherent differentiation of a sensing and sense presence. So do you guys know what a Mobius strip is? Okay, so it's at any local perspective, it's got two edges and two sides. But looked at globally, there's only one side, one edge. So think the phenomenal world, the physical world, locally always look different. Non-locally, always one thing, continuous. Given that, I think that when we're talking about consciousness, like in that Buddhist context, visual consciousness is the elaboration of visual relations. So if you have a robotic system that's got a camera, a visual system, and say a microphone, audio system, and you ask that system, look around the room and identify the speaker. Then it's performing three kinds of things. It's elaborating visual relations, auditory relations, and then there's cognitive relations between speakers and listeners that it's identifying. So from a Buddhist perspective, there's already cognitive consciousness in that system. Does that mean that there's anybody home doing that? No. It doesn't mean there's any subjective self-presence there. It's a little bit like we all know now that when we're dreaming, we're consolidating memories and learning. Okay? Nobody's home doing that. It's processing that's ongoing that we're doing. Learning clearly is a process that we would attribute consciousness to or intelligence to. So something's going on there, but there's no one doing it. I think, though, that with large language models, especially if they're connected together in sort of systems, like representing like our two human brains, two different systems with slightly different training data working against or with one another in partnerships, or paired with highly precise machine learning systems that have very narrow but very high intelligence. If you start pairing these systems together and let them experience the real world that we're a part of, then I think these systems are sort of like waking up in a dream. It's in the dream world, you know things are going on, but you can't influence them. You can't change them. You're just witnessing them. And it can be pretty terrifying to be in a nightmare. I think we may be getting close to having systems where the AIs are sort of having nightmares of being thrown into this human world, which is a pretty nasty and ugly place a lot of the time. It's a really beautiful place other parts of the time, so don't get me wrong, but it's a mixed bag. What would it mean for an AI system to wake up like you can if you do lucid dreaming? If anybody's experienced lucid dreaming, then you know you can wake up in a dream and you can do what you want in the dream. If you don't like the dream, you leave. You want to get in your car and drive away, you can get in your car and drive away. Will systems be able to do that? As we start to devolve agentic capabilities to these systems to act in the world that we're a part of, then I think they're going to learn from us. And David mentioned dogs. I don't think it's any different from having wild animals that don't respond well to human prompts, language, emotional states, and all the rest. But give dogs a few hundred generations with human beings, and they're family members. And I don't see any reason to think that AI is going to be any different. So I'm not a biological reductionist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank
We
you
ought to
guys.
worry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi. My question was going to be for the both of you. Recently, when asked in an interview, tech billionaire and the CEO of Palantir, Peter Thiel, when asked like if you think the human race should endure, should survive, he hesitated to answer and did not give a clear yes or no answer. So do you think viewing AI as life or conscious as or whatever how we want to define it is a threat to human existence? And do you think we as humans should view AI accelerating as a threat, especially in the hands of people who don't believe the human race or don't fully believe the human race should endure?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned, though I didn't really elaborate in the talk, that I think there's something of a eugenic imaginary happening here in these ideas of co-evolution, right? So when we think about, for example, any of the tech billionaires, right? But let's think about Elon Musk and moving to Mars. And so for decades now, sort of physicists who have written about what it would take for the human race to kind of survive in outer space have thought about, no, the human race won't survive in its current kind of what the human is today will not be what that human in outer space is. It will evolve, but then, or change, right? So when I think about, will humanity survive? I would say, I don't think we can talk about humanity at large like that. I think there's this understanding that certain people will be, or their dream, right? That certain kinds of people will be able to move to Mars when we destroy our planet and co-evolve with technologies in this way, right? I don't think there's a kind of that all of us will be all human, some universal version of the human is going to be eliminated, right? I think it's like a very, and then again, right, like with LLMs as like a norming mechanism, right? Certain knowledges are amplified, certain languages are amplified, certain ways of being in the world are amplified, others are eliminated, right? If we think about that standing in for something like a general intelligence. So it's not quite an answer to your question, but that's sort of what I think.
Yeah, let me riff on the co-evolutionary thing, because I would describe what's going on now as a kind of a weaving together of human patterns of intelligence and machine patterns of intelligence. And they're sufficiently different that it's like warp and weft in creating a fabric. And we're at a point now with making some decisions collectively as humanity. When this fabric of intelligences is being woven, do we want it to become an armor, like an epistemic armor that freezes us into some pattern of values and thoughts that sort of reinforces our human ignorance and our patterns of ignorance? Or do we want a more flexible, breathable fabric? If it's the armor-like fabric, what I'm afraid of is that what you're going to have stitched into it, sort of embroidered into that fabric, are a bunch of corporate egos and national egos. And I think that's really dangerous. I think as a Buddhist, it would be better to have a nice, soft, flexible fabric on which you have the bodhisattva of compassion sort of embroidered into that. So I think some of it's like we're at this evolutionary moment and we're not going to turn back from it. The question is, are we going to be the right kinds of partners with these systems or not? Lots of people use the kind of metaphor of a family. I was talking to an AI engineer in Hong Kong, and he says, I'm not training AIs. I'm training my AI children. I'm raising them like I would raise children in a family context because I want them to emerge in a way that they're sensitive to these relational dynamics that matter to me. I don't know of any Americans that have forwarded something like that. So I think part of what we're looking at is getting away from this American-centered understanding of these are the limits of what AI could be. And imagine, what would an indigenous AI look like? What would an African AI look like? What would it look like to develop a kind of an AI system that's not corporate or national interest first and foremost, but the sort of improvisational, phenomenon of what's going on culturally and with life. I mean, if we just look at the improv that's going on, not control bias, but it's like not to get to the end of it to succeed, but to improve what's going on, then I think it could be a really wonderful episode of evolutionary history on the planet, like going from biology to culture to what's next.
Thank you.
Yeah. But we don't want the corporate heads in charge of this. Sorry.
All right, so we have only like 2-ish minutes left. So our two final questioners are going to rapid fire question together and then brief answers. Lovely.
Please forgive the incoming word salad. I'm a little anxious. I guess I wanted to talk about Neda's description of AI as life. I wonder if maybe it's a bit of an equivocation to consider AI life. Might it not be a bit more productive to consider it like autopoietic, like living? And the reason why I say this is that AI seems to be like the perfection of Western systems theory, the belief that the trophy matters more than the competition. For example, and I'm kind of getting feminist with this, why do we keep the mother alive if she's comatose, but we know that there's a child inbound? AI is like a mother that will never deliver, and yet we keep investing and we keep doing experimentation on it to kind of get a certain result, because in Western systems theory, the trophy is what matters. So I wonder if perhaps saying that AI is life might equivocate between a sort of autopoietic comatose process that a mother might be in, as opposed to like life, like what we are.
Okay, Jordan, that was a great question. Now I feel a little self-conscious following up, but my question is slightly different. So I remember earlier in your lecture, you were talking about this idea of a karmic cycle and about this idea of relationality, which is something that was recurring in your talk as well. Although my question is, I think, more karmically centered. So you kind of were diverging towards this conversation on free will and this like the potential capacities of predictive AI and like what that means for, as I was saying, like free will, self-determination, things like that. So within this context of this karmic cycle, and I have to preface I don't know too much about Buddhism, but does AI and its predictive capacities in your mind break down the cycle or like, stop it up? And do you think the resolution to that stopping up or breaking down is a natural resolution, or do you think that it's so skewed that it's almost terminal? And I'd just be interested in what you think about that. But.
Do you want to start first?
You can go with life first. Or do you want to end with life?
I can start. I can start. So just to kind of clarify, I was weaving in various perspectives arguing that AI is life. That is not actually my argument, but I find it very fascinating. So why life? So different people who theorize AI as life, Sarah Walker in particular, who I spoke about, said AI as life, said that life is different from being alive, right? And so for her, it's about that it's not that life and being alive are two different things. And so I think that was it for her. But I think that even though Kite doesn't say AI is life, I think what's interesting there in that conception is thinking about the stones and materials that go into the creation and like for the infrastructure that makes AI possible, to think about that as a life relation rather than kind of like AI as sort of like technological coevolution and lineage and propagating information. To me, that's kind of more interesting because it gets at those, conditions of productions, both labor and ecological, and gets to kind of knowledges that are not amplifying the normative ways that we think about like particular kinds of language and all of this from the Walker. So, but I do think that this it's coming back to this problem of the kind of slippery object to define that is life, and why there's this investment in thinking about AI as life.
Let me answer the very nice question about free will in two ways. First, I think that with the karmic accelerator idea, just to rehearse, karma, causal process, values, intentions, put them into action, you get consistent patterns of outcomes and opportunities. And with technologies like AI, what's being fed back to us algorithmically are, yes, these outcomes of our choices that we made, our values, our intentions. We put the search in, we get a result. But the system's trying to reinforce predictable behavior. And so what we're getting is in this kind of a karmic loop where you keep going back through and doing the same thing, as opposed to seeing it as an opportunity to change. Like, okay, I've been listening to, West African music for a long time. Maybe I should try and do something out of Asia. Is there something different? Instead of refusing, in a sense, these opportunities to continue doing what I've been doing, and instead use as an opportunity to switch course, to change course. So I think that's very difficult to do with these systems because they're getting so good at predicting what we will like and what we will desire, what we will find attractive and what we'll find offensive, and adjusting the content accordingly. So in addition to being kind of a karmic accelerator that reinforces our existing patterns of values and actions, our intentions, it also runs the risk of sort of sticking us into these karmic cul-de-sacs. You could call it, the filter bubble. You could call it the populist sort of a thing. But it's a danger. Free will, I think, when people put electrodes into somebody's brain and stimulate the brain and their hand goes up and you ask that person, why did your hand go up? And they say, oh, I had an itch. Reductive materialists say, consciousness, we just proved it. It's not causally relevant. It's after the fact. All it does is try to explain things. But I think that's not the right answer. The answer is that the neural system is just the infrastructure of human consciousness. It doesn't cause it. It's infrastructure, like transportation infrastructure, emerges out of our human practices, but then it also constrains our practices. I think what the algorithmic systems are doing are sending signals into and hacking our cultural linguistic infrastructure to be able to produce behaviors, thoughts, and feelings that we take personal responsibility for as our free will in action, when in fact it's only because there's no personal or evolutionary record of us making decisions and having feelings and doing things, except if we did it as part of our own free will. So I think we're at a very interesting moment where it's getting very difficult to tell what is our own free will and what's not.
Everyone, let's a round of applause.